DatoCMS is an amazing headless CMS, and I've used it to power the marketing side of my multi-tenant food ordering app for quite some time. Our marketing website was written in Nuxt and was configurable through DatoCMS. And while this worked great, DatoCMS cost us over €200 a month. So in an effort to reduce our monthly tooling costs, I recently migrated away from DatoCMS to Filament PHP. And let me tell you, I was pretty impressed by the developer experience and the end result. In this video, I wanted to do a deep dive into our current marketing website setup. But before we dive in, give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Without any further ado, let's dive in. Our current setup involves a Laravel app on the backend, Vue and Tailwind on the front end, and Inertia as the glue in between. Our website is pretty simple and consists of a couple of predefined themed Tailwind UI blocks. For example, we have a testimonial section, an FAQ section, a hero section, etc. Our website has three major models. We have pages, we have blog posts, and we have modules, which is basically an add-on customers can buy. Our website is available in multiple languages, and to achieve that, we use Laravel Translatable, so we can localize the necessary columns on the models. To define the application language, we use Laravel Localization, which is able to read the language from the URL and set it in the application. DatoCMS serves images through ImageX, and this allows for on-the-fly manipulations. So to achieve this functionality in my new setup, I deployed a serverless image handler on AWS. The serverless image handler is able to do on-the-fly transformations on images residing in an S3 bucket, and I configured Filament to upload images to this S3 bucket, and in my front end I could then request images through my CloudFront URL and apply on-the-fly transformations. Pretty neat. Finally, the website has a couple of global settings, for example for the navigation and the footer, but more on that later. Now let's take a look at how pages are built in Filament. DatoCMS allows you to define complex and repeatable structures that can be embedded inside records. This is a very powerful feature, and this was the most challenging to replicate in Filament. Using a mix of blocks and repeaters, I was able to come pretty close to my setup in DatoCMS. I defined my own rich content block that I was able to apply on a page and a post resource. In the content section of a page or post, I am now able to add any number of blocks in any order I want. Let's create a new page so I can demonstrate this concept. Alright, let's create a new page. We're currently in the Dutch locale. Let's call it Hello YouTube. And as you can see, the slug was automatically generated, and you can achieve this behavior by watching the title value. And my advice to you is to never immediately generate a slug, but always do this on a debounce. Now, if we save the page, we can go to the front end and visit this newly created page. And as you can see, it's now an empty page. So let's add a block. Let's go back to Filament and add a title section. Title, subtitle. Let's create a plain variant and let's remove the default button that got added here. Now, when I save and we go back to the front end, we will see that we have our title section. That's pretty cool. We can also add some more content, for example, an FAQ section. We can add a question and then we can add an answer. And when we visit the front end again, we will see our FAQ section with our question and our answer. Now imagine we want to translate this page to English. If we switch the locale to English, we will be presented with an empty page. Now, recreating this page will be a lot of work potentially, because we may have added dozens of blocks. And that's why I created the copy from locale action. If we click it, we can choose our locale to copy from, in our case Dutch. And if we press submit, everything from the Dutch locale will be copied onto the English page. And then we can easily make the necessary adjustments. If we press save, we can now go to the English variant of the page and we will see our title section and our FAQ section like in the Dutch version. This is a massive time saver, especially in larger pages. Finally, we also have an SEO field in which we can customize the title, the description, and an OG image. In my current setup, the translation functionality in Filament works great, but it was a bit of a pain to get right, because the original translatable plugin was pretty buggy. To mitigate the issues, Laravel has taken over maintenance of the translatable plugin, and by simply adding their repository to the repositories in your composer.json and by installing their fork, most, if not all bugs were resolved. To render the blocks in the front end, I use a generic renderer component. This component is able to render a component dynamically by looking at the type of the block that's passed down and by choosing the correct component to render. The block that is able to render an article section is a bit special, because to render it correctly, we need to do a database query to fetch the blog posts. The block itself is pretty simple and allows us to define a maximum number of posts to display per page. In the controller, I then loop over all the blocks, and when I encounter a blog section, I do a database query and replace the data with my paginated Eloquent resource. And in order to keep things simple, we assume there can only be one paginated resource per page. And for our modules, we took a pretty similar approach. Now, this kinda reminds me of archive pages in WordPress back in the day, but much nicer obviously. Blog posts follow a pretty similar rendering pattern as pages, whereas modules are much simpler and only allow for a single rich editor. Pages, blog posts and modules all have configurable SEO fields which are saved on the model itself for convenience. These fields are optional, and Inertia is able to fall back to other values like title, for example, if necessary. Now that we covered rendering of dynamic content, let's talk about our navigation and our footer. In DatoCMS, there is a special type of schema for a single block, and this is very useful for things like settings. In this single block, I defined the navigation and the footer links, as well as a list of redirects, fixed routes, and translations of static elements. This is unfortunately not fully possible in Filament in the way that DatoCMS does it, but I figured out a way to achieve something similar. Let me show you. I created a settings resource and added a sort of concept of types in the value field by using a block with a limit of 1. So, for example, I'm creating a setting here. Let's add a key of YouTube in the group example, and then here we can add our value. Whenever I create a setting, I choose a type I want the value to be, and this can be a string, a rich editor, or something more specific like a navigation link or a footer. So let's add a rich editor, for example, hello world, and we can save. Most importantly, these settings are language specific, so I can switch to English, I can copy from Dutch, and now we have a localized YouTube setting. In my code, I defined a global localized settings object that takes this first block and puts it at the root. And in my Inertia Globals middleware, I pass down this entire global settings object to the view layer. And finally, for convenience, I also added this helper method that is able to get a value from my global settings using a dot style notation. This comes in handy for defining static routes like a contact page, but still have the ability to have localized routes. Finally, I have a default version of my setting defined in code, and on every deploy I run a script that ensures these values end up in the database so I can customize them in Filament. This is a super convenient way to work with settings and to be able to customize them. And last but not least, let's talk about performance. Our website is server-side rendered using Inertia SSR, meaning it's crawlable and usable without JavaScript. As you can see, we can still click around on the website even when JavaScript is disabled. Setting this up is pretty straightforward. In the Forge interface, you can just click a toggle, or you can run the command artisan inertia SSR in something like supervisor. A quick tip: if you're running multiple sites on the same server, make sure the server port is different for all SSR instances. Otherwise, your Inertia SSR script will not be able to start up. To keep the website running smooth, I use Laravel Response Cache from Spatie. But there's a big caveat with Inertia. So, as you may know, when first visiting a route, Laravel will render HTML and then your front-end Vue app will take over. Every subsequent navigation, Laravel will only return JSON, and the Vue app will take care of rendering the page. This means that every page has two representations, an HTML representation and a JSON representation. The default cache profile of Laravel Response Cache has two problems. One, it will not cache responses coming from inertia, and two, every route is only able to have a single cached response. So caching HTML and JSON for the same route is not possible. Luckily, we can create our own inertia-aware cache profile and allow both the HTML and the JSON representation to be cached by adding an inertia or no inertia suffix. And finally, whenever we update resources, for example, a page, we can invalidate both the JSON and HTML representation by calling forget on both the cached inertia responses as well as the HTML responses. Whenever we edit a global setting, like a navigation link, we have to invalidate the entire cache, because the navigation is visible on every page. And on every deploy, we also clear the entire cache, so the latest JavaScript and CSS is always loaded. This ensures our marketing website is blazing fast and cached for 99% of all requests. And that concludes the video. If you like this content, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you in the next one.